Calls to order the March 26th Policy Committee meeting. It's approximately 1:30 on the 26th. We have voting for the Assembly, Mr. Steele and Mr. Flynn. Ms. Heil is here for DEC. Mr. Campbell is here for DOT. Mr. Sullivan will perhaps be joining us in a few moments. Please make note when he shows up, but he is not here to start the meeting. Mr. Lyon, will you take us through our public involvement announcement, please?
Bet. All AMATS meetings are public meetings, and the public is invited to comment on different items. We have a business item. We'll have a presentation by staff or a consultant. Then the committee will be given a chance to discuss it, and then at that point, the public will be invited to comment. If you are going to make a comment, please, when you stand up, state your name clearly so we can have it for the record.
Thank you. We have before us a proposed agenda.
Move to approve?
Move to approve.
I'll second, Mr. Chairman.
Moved and seconded.
And may I make a motion for amendment?
Of course.
Thank you, sir. We've had a little bit of public discussion of an adjustment to the tip regarding allocation of funds. Would appreciate an update from staff on that. And not that anybody providing informational report is any less important than that. But my schedule is sort of tight, so if it's possible to put that at the beginning of the informational report, so I'd appreciate that.
So you've got two requests in your motion, to move it up and to change it to a informational report by staff on what topic again? Bike?
The bike and ped reallocation.
Bike and ped reallocation. Okay, we have a motion to amend the agenda.
I need a second from somebody.
I'll second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion on the amendment?
Still don't know where you want to put it.
I just
You'd like to put it at
6A and a half.
Yeah, or half A. Yeah, I get it. Any discussion on Mr. Flynn's amendment to the agenda? Seeing none, any opposition to Mr. Flynn's? Seeing none, that is moved to the agenda. Any other motions to modify the agenda? Seeing none, is there any objection to the agenda as now modified by Mr. Flynn's amendment? Seeing none, we have an approved agenda. Thank you. We have minutes from February 26th.
Move to approve.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any corrections, amendments, modifications?
I think it's very crisp and right on point, so thank you to the staff.
Any objection to the minutes being approved? Seeing none, the minutes are approved. We have one business item today. Mr. Lyon?
I believe Mr. John Ganalen from DOT
Okay.
is going to present on the interim NTP. Vivian Underwood is going to start off, though.
Okay.
There we go.
Thank you.
I'm not in charge, clear.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be very brief. As you know, we're preparing an interim MTP update to effectively extend the current MTP while we work on other related tasks for the next major update. One of the important tasks, one of the requirements for this is to have a fiscally constrained financial plan. And that means that we just are able to demonstrate that we have reasonable expectation that we'll have enough revenues to cover costs over the life of the plan, which is a 20-year plan. And we've been working very closely with DOT and PF. Aaron has been exceptional at this, and Jennifer Witt has helped us a lot, and James. And the TIC approved the contents of the memo that you've had, and there's a table also of revenue sources and methodologies that we'll be asking you to review and approve also. That's it. And if you have any questions, please let us know. But I think we just have 10 minutes, so there's a lot of ground to cover. So I'll turn it over to Aaron.
Good afternoon. I'm Aaron Young-Nalen. I'm the Anchorage Area Planner and acting AMATS Planner for the Department of Transportation. Trying to get through this as quick as possible. There are a couple of extra items that you have in your packet that's not for approval, but they're for your information. The first one is kind of the PowerPoint presentation I'm going to be giving so you can follow along with the slides. And the second one is kind of a bunch of overview information that's talking about everything we're going to be addressing today. So it's there just for you to kind of take a look at, and if you have any questions, just let me know as I'm going through my presentation. So today's agenda, we're going to talk about the 2035 MTP revenue sources and forecast, what was previously approved. Then we're going to go into what has changed, what we received versus what we expected, and then we're going to kind of just end it with were the assumptions reasonable. So the first thing, there are four main elements that we're going to address. We have the inflation rate for construction, then we have the project cost, which we've updated, then we have the inflation rate for revenue, and then we have the revenue by sources. So the first thing we have is the project cost inflation. Now, why we have project cost inflation is because you have to be able to account for inflation for revenue and construction. So what we did for the 2030 is we did short term was 4%, which was consistent with the STIP at the time, and then FHWA guidance. Then long term, we reduced it down to 3.5% to account for fluctuations in oil and construction costs over time. Transit had a zero inflation rate because transit dollars were in year of expenditure dollars already, so we didn't have to do anything to kind of inflate them at that time. But we made some adjustments for this interim update, which is on the left side of the screen. Short term, we reduced it to 2.5%, and a lot of that has to do with the current price of oil and asphalt are significantly lower than we had expected at this time. And with discussions with the TAC, we decided to reduce it down to 2.5% to account for the current low levels of everything right now. But the long term, it's a little harder for us to be able to predict where it's going to be. So we decided to keep it consistent with the current MTP and leave it at 3.5%. And transit, we adjusted as well. We talked with transit. And although they're in year of expenditure dollars, we kind of wanted to account for the additional inflation that could occur over time. So we worked with them and we used a 1.5% inflation. Any questions about that? Okay. So here are the overall project costs. Left side is the interim, and as you can see, we ended it in 2010 dollars at $2.3 billion. When we updated it, it's now 2.4. So notice we've had an increase of project costs, but we're in 2014 dollars, so that's not unexpected. And we've been able to refine a lot of information about the road project. So now we have actual construction costs of Dowling Road, of Seward Highway. So we're able to put those in, and then the Muni project costs were also refined and brought up to date. So we're able to incorporate all that into here. We also updated the bike ped trails project cost by inflating the amount for another couple of years at the 2.5% inflation rate. So although the price is different, it's really not that bad in the grand scheme of things. It's not significantly higher than what we'd expected at this time. So we were pretty reasonable on our assumptions there for the project costs. Next is revenue. Revenue inflation was pretty easy. We used the Anchorage Consumer Price Index. We averaged it out and got 2.5%. And we looked at it and updated it for using the 11, 12, 13, and 14, and we got 2.6% because our CPI actually increased significantly. Even though 14 has kind of decreased a little, it still was a high enough jump between the 11, 12, and 13 years to get us up to 2.6%. Now we get into the actual assumptions. So the local assumptions, we're using the CIP provided to us from the Muni. And so we put all that information in, and then we updated it for this interim update, and we made no additional changes beyond that. We just updated the information to actuals and then their expanded CIP, which goes out to 2020. And as you can see, it was 4% of projected revenue coming from local sources. It still is 4% of projected revenue from local sources. The reason it hasn't adjusted in any way is because the overall program went down, and so it kept it at that 4% level. Next, we have state assumptions. This was a big change. We were originally assuming, we went through the capital budget and we talked about, funds that are going towards MTP projects. And we kind of averaged them out and we were able to come out with how much can we expect yearly. So in the old one, we did a 5-year because that's all we had available at the time, 2006 to 2011. This time we updated it, so we did a 10-year average for it because we had a lot more information available. Another big change is the ATF, the Alaska Transportation Fund. Most of you recall this was something that Peggy Wilson was championing, but it never really went anywhere. In the old one, we said it would start in 2015, so there'd be an initial investment, then there'd be a 5% return on that investment, with 28% of that coming to AMATS based on current allocation amounts. This time through, we've just pushed that back out to 2025. And the reason we still have it in there is because it's reasonable to assume that at some point the state is going to have to address infrastructure at a different level than what they're doing now. So we have it in there just in case something comes up. It's a reasonable assumption. Next are the state GO bonds. We predicted starting in 2014 we'd get one every 6 years. What actually happened is we got a massive one, 91 million in 2013. But because of the reduction in state funds, we decided that it wasn't reasonable to just do 20 or 6 years from 2014. We need to push it out a little further to be pretty conservative about what money is going to be coming in. So we said the next hit is not starting until 2025 and then 6 years after that. We still kept it 6 years because that's about how much time has passed between each GO bond hit. So for the interim, another thing we did is we did a reduction in state funds for 16, 17, and 18. We zeroed it out. So that is a huge reduction to just account for the fact that we are not anticipating any money from the state coming into MTP-related projects for those years. Is that actually what's going to happen? We don't know. But because we don't know, it better be safe than sorry and be a little more conservative about it. And then if we can update it later with actuals to see what actually happened. So for the 2030 MTP, it was 56% of the revenues would come from state sources. Based on our current update right now, only 42% would come from state resources. Any questions there? Okay. Federal, another big one. So, sorry, that should say 2035 MTP on the left side. For the 2035, we assumed a 30% reduction in the AMATS allocation. That was accounted for, so federal dollars were going to be reduced. MAP 21 was coming out, and then some of the initial bills that came out with MAP 21 kind of showed this huge reduction in state funds. So we wanted to reflect that in the 2035 MTP. But when we actually looked at it for the interim, that reduction, that 30% reduction, didn't actually come into effect. MAP 21, the authorization bill, actually was a lot more level in its approach on federal funding. So we maintained a pretty good level that we put in there, no drastic decreases. AMATS allocation is $23.9, $24.9 million per year. So we have that reflected with actual obligations in the 2011 through 14, and then what we expect to be keeping it level until CPI is applied to increase it in inflation in the outer years. Next thing, federal highway other discretionary funds. This is for livability grants, and a few other things like that. Sorry, I can't think of the top of my head. We basically assumed about $5 million per year for the life of the program starting in 2014. However, based on the amount of effort it takes to initiate and put those grants into effect, no grant was received except the $50,000 one, and it was too cumbersome, too expensive to be able to actually put that grant in. So they returned that grant and they said, we're not going to do any more of these for now. So what we've done is we've zeroed it out for the life of the program just because discretionary funding is becoming harder to come by, and we want to kind of just make it a little more realistic than it was last time. And all other funding sources are the same. So HSIP, FHWA funds for NHS, non-NHS, were just updated to reflect actual obligations and then use those to do a historical average and increase out for future years. The 2035 assumed 40% of the projected revenue would come from federal sources, but what we're saying now is actually 54% of it will come from federal resources. So a pretty drastic shift there. So here's just kind of a couple pie charts so you can see. The MTP 2035 said we get about $3.8 billion in revenue. When we updated it, we're expecting now $3.5 billion in revenue. And a lot of that has to do with reduction in state funding. And so as you can see, we've kind of shifted from being more state to more federal at this time. So here are just some charts to give you a kind of an example. This is what we thought it was going to be like. We assumed that the federal was going to do a huge dive in 2013 when MAP 21 came through and then kind of come back up a little and keep it level, whereas the state was going to be substantially higher with the big hits that you see in there, the arrhythmia, as some people like to call it, are the GO bond hits in there. What actually happened is this. We had a huge hit in state with the 91 million in GO bonds, and then we're anticipating a severe reduction down there, almost a complete zeroing out of it. There's still some little in there for state. And then we kind of go back up with some of the GO bond hits later in there, but federal has actually gone up and kind of leveled up and it's leveled off, and we're expecting to kind of stay level. The reason it's going upward is to account for inflation. So just some more to kind of show you the actual amounts that we were assuming, excluding Kabata. And so we have, as you can see here, state was the predominant source of funding, and federal was significantly reduced. And this one we have it just kind of reversed. Okay, so in conclusion, so what we did is when we went through this, we actually had to just take, are our assumptions reasonable? And we're saying that yes, our assumptions are reasonable. Because we are not really that far off from the revenue and the cost, And because we're not really making any huge predictions about, oh, lots of money is coming in from somewhere, it's keeping it level, keeping it moderate throughout the entire thing. Another benefit is that no additional modeling will have to be done for the interim update because we're not removing any projects from the update. Even projects that are completed, we are not removing them. We are identifying which projects have been completed so we can use it as a performance measure of how we did during those years, but we're not actually removing it because the amount of time and effort it would take to remove those, go through each of the revenue sources to remove those specific ones for those projects was too cumbersome at this time. So when the 2040 update comes through, we will recognize that those projects are completed and remove them and remove the revenue sources for 11 through 14-ish. We haven't really decided on that yet. We're still working on it. So ignore the top bullet. I forgot to change that. But our next step is a public review draft in June that we'll be bringing by for you guys to look at and release. And then we have December 31st is our target to have this document completely done and approved, the air quality approved by FHWA. Yes, please.
I'd like to add that we just recently had our Federal Highway Administration certification review, and Aaron actually gave a demonstration of this tool to them, and they were very pleased with it. They thought it was a very good example of what MPOs can do. So I thought I would pass that along, that they were very happy with it.
Okay, does that conclude your 10 minutes, sir?
Not sure how long it actually took, but
We are close.
Thank you.
Well, I appreciate it.
thanks.
I think other people here appreciate it too.
You're welcome.
Could you repeat that?
So let me ask if there's anyone from the crowd that would like to comment on I'm not going to pronounce the last name, on Aaron's presentation. Any comments on the funding assumptions that are being made here? Okay, I will turn it loose to the committee. Mr. Steele.
It's as good a crystal ball read as any of us have, I suppose. So, I guess that's a compliment.
Thank you.
Mr. Flynn?
Can't top that. I do have a question on the table. On the first page, at the bottom, state match for federal funds, assume state match for 90% of ARCC and federal highway funds. What are ARCC funds?
Should be Alaska Railroad.
That's railroad funds.
Yeah, so there's probably a misspelling there for that.
Okay. When you say state match, are we talking his dollars? Or are we talking your dollars?
Assuming our dollars for state match, because they'll be matching,
Out of DOT?
well, not necessarily out of DOT, but Jennifer, I don't know, not really too sure what you're asking. So who's going to be making them? Who's going to be doing the match?
Yeah, traditionally the matches come from the railroad. And I know that's technically a state dollar since they're a state entity, but I've never seen this particular line item before.
Well, I mean, this particular line item is just talking about all state match for federal funds. Because federal funds come in, we'll have to have state, or we have to have a local match. So the state meets a lot of the match on the federal funds.
Can I try to
Maybe I'm not asking the question very well.
the gap here? I think a lot of times what we have is when we talk about a project, we say it's a $20 million project that's federally funded. And we don't really break it down into what component of it is state funded and what component of it is federally funded. You know, the reality of it is that it's a $20 million project, you know, the
Just chunk of
state
state
is
money.
really bringing in a couple $1 million to it. We don't typically lay that out. I think that's just what they've done here, is they've just said that, yeah, when we say we're getting X number of federal dollars, we're also bringing in this many state dollars. I don't think it changes the dollar amount of our federal program. It just recognizes the two different components of it.
I appreciate that.
Okay, that doesn't answer your question. Okay.
Mr. Lindeman probably can clarify this. Who is providing the state match for the federal dollars that benefit the Alaska Railroad?
The Alaska Railroad is.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions?
That's it.
Mayor Sullivan, no questions? Ms. Heil? Okay, I think you are complete. Thanks, Aaron. You did a good job.
Need a motion
Yes, please.
to approve the interim plan,
You want the assumptions for the,
the assumptions.
It's on the back page of the.
it's on the transcript.
Okay.
So we need a motion to approve the assumptions and the approach outlined in the aforementioned memo.
Correct.
So moved.
Moved and seconded. Thank you. Any further discussion from the committee? Anyone opposed to that motion? That motion passes. Thank you.
I think, Mr. Chairman, you also need a second recommendation, or second motion for approval of the staff recommendations for the interim 2013 MTP capital revenue sources and methodology. That's the table. Right, Mr. Lyons, is that correct? You need both?
Are we asking them to approve the table as well? Or
Yes.
does that include in this two
Second,
separate
on
motions?
the
Moved and
sources of
seconded.
The revenue sources and methodology table.
Aye.
Mr. Flynn is so moved. We approve the recommendations in the capital revenue sources and methodology found as attached. Ms. Heil has seconded it. Any further discussion from the board? Any objections to that? That is also approved. Thank you, Mr. Flynn.
Try to keep you honest, Mr. Chairman.
I'm not sure you want to take that on.
You said it, not me.
I think that concludes our business items. We're moving on to informational reports. We have now item .5A, I think, the bike plan update. Mr. Lyon, you have been tagged with that, so please give us an update on the bike plan
We'll give
situation.
an update on a bike plan implementation project, which is in the current TIP and which was in the previous TIP. In December of 2012, this policy committee approved a major amendment number 4 to the 2011-14 TIP, which, among other things, added an additional $1.3 million in the 2014 year for that bike plan implementation project. There was already $1 million in 2013 for that project, and so the AMATS committees added an additional $1.3 million in 2014. As you are well aware, as we go through our fiscal year and we look at the projects that are in our program, if we get towards the end of the year and the projects haven't been obligated already, we start to get a little antsy because we don't want to lose those funds. And so what oftentimes happens is we'll move the funding around to another project that is already ready to go or is already in progress and needs more funds. So around, I'll get the exact time frame, but around the obligation report, which was the third quarter 14 obligation report, we had a meeting in August 28th of 2014, when this committee approved an obligation report which obligated out of that 1.3 million, about 100 and some odd thousand, to the Arctic Bike Lanes project. The rest of the money was moved to another project that was ready to go, and honestly, we just have not tracked down exactly which project it went to, but it went to a project that was in the TIP that was ready to go. That money was moved out. It's part of the program. It's part of what we normally do to make sure our funds don't get lost and move to some other project that may not be in the AMATS allocation. The only other thing I wanted to add is the fact that this project is still in the 15 to 18 TIP. There's funding in each year of that TIP for this project. It is certainly possible that this committee, AMATS in particular, or in general, but this committee in particular could look at the de-obligations that occur in the future and move additional funds over there if they were so inclined, and staff would certainly make that recommendation as we move along. So happy to answer more detailed questions if you have them. That's kind of the general parameters of what occurred.
Okay. Mr. Flynn, I believe this is your item. Do you feel that is a satisfactory explanation for your curiosity?
I do appreciate the additional information. I guess I'll just put a little marker out there as we work through this year's work plan. I'd like to see if there's a way we can find a way to replace those dollars for the bike plan implementation as we have different projects that move at different paces.
Yeah, I think we all recognize that on a year-to-year basis, we sometimes don't hit the targets exactly, but I think that we do, over the years, have a pretty good record of making the targets in a cumulative sense.
And that's why, for example, prior to your tenure on this committee, we established in our policies and procedures some flexibility,
Right.
where TE is 10 to 15% as opposed to a hard number.
Right.
I think that's how.
I have a question. So
Okay.
how's the obligation rate going on this project so far for this fiscal year?
The original $1 million was obligated, and CRW is under contract right now, and they're designing 12 or 15 projects that were the high priority list on the bike plan implementation. I think they're at 65%. There is a website up. I'm sorry, I don't know it off the top of my head, but I can certainly send it to you. But it has those specific projects on a map, an interactive map that you could select. So that first $1 million is ready to roll.
Right, but what about the 650,000 that's in 2015?
I don't believe that has
Been obligated
been
yet?
obligated yet, as far as I know.
It's probably really important to watch that, to make sure it's getting obligated before adding new monies in that may not
Well,
be
yeah,
obligated,
and
so.
part of the issue is that, we can obligate a first chunk in anticipation of having a contractor on board and, with the TORA to transfer the money from the state over to the city if we're managing the project. But we can't obligate a second chunk without having a contractor on board. So we obligated the first $1 million and started the process of getting the TORA and getting the RFP going, all that sort of stuff. But, so we're at the point of designing some projects. Our choice is to add additional money, I guess, to continue design, but until we get a finished design, we can't obligate the next phase, which would be construction. So we might decide as we get closer, let's just put more money to design right now, so we don't lose it, because the designs may not be complete. It's not my area of expertise, the different percentages and how far you are in your design study report and all that sort of stuff, but we're going to be paying very close attention to this to make sure that 600,000 goes to this project, either if it's ready, construction, or if not, design.
It's just an education for managing expectations. It's-
Okay. Any further comments from the committee? I guess there's one thing I'd like to clarify, that quite a bit of the news that came out of this, and I think inappropriately identified DOT as the responsible party for moving this money. And I believe it was an AMATS action that moved this money. It was not a DOT action. So anybody that is interested in that, so note that correction. Most of you that aren't can carry on.
I see the press are taking notes to correct this.
I'm sure we'll do a headline tomorrow.
You care to borrow my Kevlar vest?
Yeah, you paid the big money to take the hits, right? Okay, I think that concludes that issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the indulgence.
Yes, sir.
We'll make sure to offer the public comment.
Sure. Is there anybody from the public who would care to comment on that? Yes, sir.
Oh, first, I might need to have my expectations managed, so. First, state my name, I apologize. Steve Cleary. I'm with Bike Anchorage, and we're hoping to get bike funding for safer streets. And so I have heard a lot, obviously, about this, and was trying to square it with what Mr. Lyons just said. And so it seemed like, on one hand, you have the $1.3 million is gone, not disappeared, but moving to other projects in a way that sometimes happens, as I understand the process. But then when you were talking, it sounded like 100,000 had gotten obligated to Arctic bike lanes, and then the 1.2 was under that de-obligation thing. Okay. So the bike community in general was surprised by that and was dismayed that it was termed as a little snafu, because it was more than 50% of the funding for that fiscal year for the part of the construction and bike plan implementation that we were interested in. So we're excited to see if there are other ways to get that money back in, because the bike plan, like all other projects, is expansive. It's $118 million to implement it. So even if you had $2.3 million every year, that's still close to 50 years before it's fully implemented. And now that got cut more than in half for this particular thing, for a procedure that, when we're talking about managing expectations, it's pretty hard to explain. I've been sitting at a lot of these meetings. I've seen a lot of tip mods. I even know what tip means. I even know what AMATS means. But the general public doesn't. And so it's really hard to see through that inside baseball to see a headline that says 1.3 million got taken away from here. And it didn't disappear, and it didn't go into somebody's suitcase and go somewhere, but it's not going to making our streets safer. And I have a nearly 7-year-old who I love to go, we just rode bike yesterday because there's no snow to ski on. And so we need to have safer streets for our Anchorage residents. And it's hard to explain to our supporters who worked hard to get you all to make that great decision to put that money in, to now see it somewhat evaporate in a way that's fairly mysterious. So anyway, I would applaud any efforts to replenish or reinstitute or reobligate that money, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir. Any further comments? Yes, ma'am.
I have a comment. I'm with AMATS. I staff the Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee. I just want to say publicly for the record that as the staffer for that committee, I did not know, and I believe Craig did not know about the de-obligation of funds until about 3 weeks ago at our February BPAC meeting. So I'm confused, and I don't mean to be argumentative, but it confuses me as to how that could have been solely an AMATS decision when myself and Craig didn't even know about the de-obligation of funds until 3 weeks ago. So perhaps that could be explained a little bit for my benefit.
Thanks for your comment. Anybody else? Mr. Flynn?
I guess, Mr. Chairman, I think what you're feeling burdened with is there is a perception, and I will not speak to its veracity, because I can't tell you, I don't know, that while AMATS is intended to be a collaborative enterprise between the state DOT and the municipality of Anchorage, there is a perception that somehow somebody within DOT moved money around and we didn't know about it. Now, maybe we did know about it and have forgotten, but that's the perception. And so I guess the lesson I take from this is when we're moving money around, particularly from programs that have a high profile, we need to really raise awareness amongst ourselves and our constituencies so that there's at least clarity of action. And I'm not casting aspersions or placing blame. I'm just sort of reading between the lines and what seems to be the general feeling. I offer that as counsel that you can take or reject as you see fit.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn, for your comments. Any further comments on this issue? Okay, I believe our next action or information report is on the admin mod number 2.
Yes, Mr. Chair, this administrative modification is to take into account changes in Table 7 of the TIP relating to the Federal Transit Administration funds that go to the Alaska Railroad. This is outside of the AMATS obligation or allocation of 23 million and change. And so it is just, they are reflecting their updates to their priorities using their FTA dollars. Because these are federal funds that are coming into the city, we need to reflect in the TIP. So it is something that the TAC administrative modifications can be approved by the TAC, and they did that at their March 5th meeting. So this is for informational purposes only. The modification has already occurred, and that our policy and procedures say that the TAC will go ahead and do those admin mods.
Okay. Any questions from the committee? Actually, let me go with the public. Let me go public. Any questions from Mr. Lyon on this informational item? Seeing none, any from the committee? None? Thank you. I believe our certification review is the next item on our informational report list.
Yes, every 4 years, the Federal Highways Administration and Federal Roads Administration come to Anchorage, and we have a 2-day process generally. We have a 25 or so page questionnaire asking us about all the planning efforts that we have. We have a public meeting, and then the Federal Highways Administration and Federal Transit Administration get together and issue a review report. And this time around, it's preliminary, but they presented at our March 5th TAC meeting and suggested that they did not see any corrective actions They had several findings and recommendations that they would share with us. We expect probably a couple months before we get the final report, but the initial report is very favorable, so happy to report that.
And did you say when we're going to get the official report? A few months? Did you-
Usually it's a couple months from now.
Okay. Questions, comments? Board members? Alaska Railroad Corporation update. I'm sorry, freight mobility update. I didn't want to skip the freight
You have
mobility
a
update.
handout there, freight mobility update. Teresa Brewer, our freight mobility coordinator, is out of the office right now, so pinch hitting for her. The main thing I wanted to point out is the fact that the freight mobility study, which was done in 2001, we've had an update waiting to happen on that for a while, and as you know, we've been working on the match for that, and we were able to identify the match through several different private entities, among them the Trucking Association, Weaver Brothers, State of Alaska, et cetera. So we have that match. The RFP went out. I believe it closes at the end of this month. So we expect to get a contractor on board fairly soon, so we'll get that project that's been sitting for a couple of years now underway. Other than that, I think the rest of it is fairly self-explanatory memo, but we're excited about that possibility.
Comments, questions on that informational topic? Committee? Mr. Flynn?
You called, Craig, what the level of local match was?
It was just under 25,000. It was 23,400.
So when you say you crowdsource it, did you like set up some sort of Kickstarter campaign, or you just call around?
We just call around. Rich Wilson, the former director of the port, and Aves Thompson were instrumental in making the calls. I won't characterize it as strong arming, but they were able to get several interested local parties to contribute because that freight mobility study will certainly impact some of those groups. But I'm very excited about that. As far as we know, first time in the nation where someone has crowdsourced or privately funded the match for this sort of thing.
Thanks. Thank you. Anything else? Okay, now the Alaska Railroad Corporation.
And your uncle walks out the door.
I know, well, that's good.
He's heard this.
Thanks. I'm Tim Sullivan. I'm the manager, external affairs of the railroad. Happy to be back. I've got a presentation, just sort of an update of what we've got going on. Very similar to the update I gave you last year. We are a railroad. We don't turn things around fast. We've been operating on the same track since 1923, so we just kind of keep going in the direction we're going. But there are a few things that are new, and I'll kind of slow down as I go through those. But all in all, a lot of the same stuff that we talked about last year. As you know the quick facts about us that we're owned by the state. We've got a 7-member board of directors, all appointed by the governor. We've got a couple of new commissioners on our board of directors with the new governor, although one is an old face with Commissioner Lucan being back, and the new commissioner of commerce is on board and will be at his first meeting here. We've got our next board meeting coming up on the 1st of April. Not much changed here other than our operating statistics, about 470,000 passengers this year, which is a good number for us, and 4.9 million tons of freight, which is down for us significantly. So kind of run through those numbers as well. Talking about the freight, you can see here, as you can see there's been an ongoing decline since about 2008, and pretty significant in some of these factors. You can see in that light coal, or light green, the coal that we have for export, it's gone from a high of almost 1.2 million tons in 2011. We're down to just about 500,000 tons for 2014, and the decline doesn't look to stop anytime soon in 2015. There's very low demand for coal on the international market, at least the coal that we have up here, and we're having a tough time getting markets to send it to. So we're working on that. In addition, if you look at the very bottom there, that bulk petroleum number, the high of about 2 million tons a year in 2008 down to 500,000 tons in 2014, and a significant decline after that because of the change in the Flint Hills petroleum refinery up in North Pole. That's most of what was being moved in that to the airport down here at Elmendorf, as well as the Anchorage International Airport. So with the change in that, we've seen a severe decline. At that point in time, in terms of revenue, that what we were moving for Flint Hills was still our largest customer altogether, but we've seen a major cut in that. The one place where we're seeing some good revenue growth, and although it isn't reflected quite in the amount of tonnage, is in our interline, which is barge service, and I'll talk about that here in just a minute as well. You see our passenger service, we had a bit of a downturn in, from a high in 2008, started declining through the recession, and we started to see growth back. The top bar you see is what are riding on our trains and our cars, and in the yellow bar are the folks that we have in our pull cars, the cruise line rail cars. The numbers for 2024 or 2014 still reflect growth in those numbers for us, the ones that we like the best. In the blue there, that we saw another about 5,000 customers that we carried in 2014 on our trains, because we get a lot more out of those customers than we do out of the pull customers that we haul. So, but all in all, seeing some good growth in the passenger numbers, and we expect some more growth again this year in 2015. Real estate, of course, this is the third leg of our stool. We've got the freight and passenger and real estate. This brings in revenue for us. It's sort of the dowry that we received when coming over from the feds. And we have about 36,000 acres that the railroad owns altogether. About half of that we use for railroad purposes and right-of-way. The other half is available for lease for the most part if there are folks who want to lease it. Our barge service that I talked about is the service that we have come up either from Seattle or from Prince Rupert up to Whittier. It's roll-on, roll-off service into Whittier, so the trains that can come up, we have the longest rail haul service in North America. We go from Panama City, Florida up to Fairbanks moving drilling equipment, 4,842 miles on that trip. We've seen quite a bit of increase in this in the last 24 months because of increased oil development on the North Slope. So we get stuff from all over the country, rails onto our barges, we rail it up to Fairbanks, and then it gets on trucks from there and heads on up to the North Slope. And of course, our FTA formula funds that you were just talking about a couple of years ago, we took a bit of a haircut on the formula funds. They cut us down about $13 million overall and increased the match from 9% to 20%. So we've been working through with MAP 21 to make sure that we're getting as much as we can out of that. Of course, the transportation bill is scheduled to be up again this year, but we'll see if they actually get to it again this year. They were 3 years behind the last time they passed it. And, there's no reason to think they'll go on schedule again this time. So our net income over the last several years, you can see we had a high in 2007 of about $16.3 million in our net income, ups and downs over the course of the last several years. What we've attributed a lot of this to is that since 2008, we've reduced our staff by nearly a third, from about 900 full-time year-round employees to down below 600. We've also taken as many cost-cutting measures in as we think we can. And while revenue has declined in terms of how much freight we've been moving, we've been able to weather the storm and keep that net income at a pretty steady level. All of this, in terms of net income, goes back into the running of the railroad. This is part of our capital projects, replacing ties, replacing rails, doing the things that need to be done to keep the railroad running. In terms of projects, we completed the Northern Rail extension over the Tanana River up in Salcha this summer. It was a $190 million project that was jointly funded by the Department of Defense and the state of Alaska. It is phase one of a four-stage project called the Northern Rail Extension to get rail all the way down to Delta Junction. With this part being done, that's great, but there is no money anywhere to do the rest of it. So we are hopeful that money appears at some point in time, and the Department of Defense wants to continue putting the rail down and rail across the bridge, but it hasn't reared up yet. Another big project is the Port McKenzie Rail extension that we are working with the Matsu Borough on. This is a project, they are about $170 million into it. Another $100 million or so left to go to get it completed. They are down asking, the Matsu Borough is down asking for funding, of course, just like everybody else. Down in Juneau this year, I understand they are asking for about $35 million just to keep the construction going this year. We'll see what comes of that.
On that note, Mr. Chairman, is the railroad, obviously, if somebody's going to pay you to build a railroad extension, that's good, you'll do it. But, I mean, have you guys internally done economic studies on just what the rail extension could potentially accomplish? I mean, to build it if there's not really, an economic driver behind it. And, we hear some things about minerals from Live and Good and stuff, but I've also heard that, to bring a Panamax ship, which is, they talked for a long time about is the export port, you'd be bringing the big Panamax ships up and filling them up, and then somebody did a little study that said the Panamaxes can actually go to Seward. You guys can rail that same good to Seward, and the Panamax actually is less time consuming, and time is money in the shipping business. I mean, you guys got a role in saying to the legislature whether or not you think this makes sense or not?
We do. We've been asked that. Chris Odnison, who was our CEO a number of years ago, was flat out asked that question, and he said if he'd had the money to put into another project, he probably would have put it somewhere else, into putting into, rehabilitation projects, capital projects, rails, ties, that sort of thing. But this is the project that's been chosen, and so this is the project we're working on. There are other economic opportunities out there once this gets built. Some of them involve moving LNG, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But in terms of working the port, there have been economic studies that the Matsu Bureau has commissioned to have done, and they talk about moving resources from interior down to going down to Port McKenzie would be more economically feasible than going over the pass and getting into Seward. So they've done those, and there may be opportunities in the future. It may not be next year, it may not be 5 years from now, but there's hope that in 15, 20 years, it's one of those things that once you build a big piece of infrastructure, which we are sorely lacking on in this state, it's rare that anybody ever looks at it and says, boy, I wish I could turn that back.
Are those the Paul Metz studies?
Yes. And then a big project we've got, positive train control. This is, as we've talked about before, an unfunded federal mandate to create essentially a high-tech dead man switch for the trains, works through satellite communication back from trains to switches to dispatch and back and forth to make sure that trains, train operators don't miss a switch, miss a signal. This was brought on about 2008 because of a couple of big accidents that happened in the lower 48, one in particular in California that killed quite a few passengers on a train. So this project is expected to cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $12 to $15 billion through the whole railroad industry. For us at the Alaska Railroad, we expect it's going to cost about $160 million, and then an additional $5 to $7 million a year just for the care and feeding of it as we go forward. We received about $34 million from the state. We are at this point about $55 million short of getting it done. We have a piece of legislation in Juneau this year asking for bonding authority from the legislature to allow us to bond for an additional $37 million, essentially maxing out our credit cards to get this done, and we'll go from there. But it still leaves us short about $18 million at the end of the day, and we're hoping to get that done because although there is a deadline of December 2015 to get this done, working with our federal regulators, we have, as long as we are continuing to make forward progress, it looks like we'll be able to go until about December of 2018 to try and get this done. What is PTC? It avoids the train-to-train collisions. We talked about that before. And why the accidents in South Carolina and Chatsworth, California. Always good to have nice graphic pictures. And if we don't comply, 61 different violations can be fined up to $100,000 a day, and it's not just the company, but the individuals at the railroad as well. The executives and the board are subject to these fines and jail time if they don't comply.
And the motivator, Mr. Chairman.
Sir.
So on positive train control, how many head-to-head collisions have we had in Alaska? Like none?
We, as far as I know, we've had one. Not head-to-head, but one train running into another train.
Yeah. And the cost was probably, a fraction of what?
Not as far as I know, nobody was hurt.
Yeah.
Nobody was injured in the accident.
So, I mean, it just seems like, you had two incidents that were fairly high profile. Is our congressional delegation any help in getting exemptions to this?
We have letters from our congressional delegation, Don Young and Lisa Murkowski, saying there is no way to get any exemption from this.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, for your benefit, basically every single FRA accident investigation starts with a paragraph. If you knuckleheads had implemented PTC like we told you to, this would not have happened.
And the biggest thing that we've been suffering through is over the course of the last 5 or 6 years since the legislation came into effect, there have been a number of accidents that PTC would have prevented. And they continue to happen over and over again. Everything from the accident in Chicago where the train ran up into the airport to the accident in the Bronx where a guy fell asleep going 85 miles an hour through a 35-mile-an-hour turn. So all of these things would have been prevented by PTC, yet they continue to happen. And while the railroad industry is saying, hey, give us some more time to do this, Congress looks at it and says, no, get it done. You keep having accidents. One of the things that happens if we don't implement PTC is the loss of passenger service. We had an economic report prepared by the McDowell Group to say what that would mean, and it's about $50 million in labor income related to our passenger service, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 900 jobs. We've been looking for other opportunities, things that we can do in terms of a railroad. We are an intermodal, interstate, and international shipper with our barge service. And we have been seeing a lot of growth in the supplies for exploration, drilling, and development on the North Slope, and we've been seeing that reflected in how much our barge service is being done. Any big pipelines or oil development that happens, we play a part in. And when a natural gas pipeline gets built, we expect that we play a big part in moving stuff for that as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about being a pipeline and on rails in terms of LNG, but we also, we've been moving refined oil, petroleum products for quite some time, and if it ever came to it, we could move crude oil as well. We've been working on a Seward master plan. We talked about the mayor talked about Panamax coming into Seward. We've been talking about how to develop Seward even more to make sure that we can be there should growth come that way. Interline the barge service, and then corridors of resources. There's always the conversation about roads to resources. We like to be included in the conversation and make it a corridors to resources. Simply put, you can always build a road to railroad geometry. It's tough to build a railroad to a road geometry. So, and pipeline on rails in terms of moving LNG to Fairbanks. We've had quite a few interested parties contact us about being able to do it. We are in process right now and have supplemented an application to the FRA to be able to move LNG by rail. We'd be the first railroad to do that commercially in the country. They do it in many other places. They do it in Europe. They do it in Japan. But we have applied, and we expect that sometime in the next 4 to 5 months we'll get approval on that. We've heard good news from back east, but we'll see how that shapes up to be here in the next couple of months. And we expect once we get that, if there is somebody who wants us to move LNG north, we have the equipment to be able to do it about 12 to 18 months after that. And these are the tanks we talk about using. They're ISO tanks. They're small. You can double stack them. We can put 2 of them on a railroad car. They cost about $150,000, and they are self-contained, so they can just be taken off of a flat car, and dropped off wherever it is that they're needed, and picked up empty and brought back down and refilled again. So it's a really efficient way of moving LNG in terms of usefulness and being able to be transported on an easy basis. We've got the state rail plan in the works. It's something that we're required to do by our federal regulators and soon to have in place to continue to receive federal fundings. DOT is working on that, and we expect we'll have that together soon. The last full state rail plan was done at transfer in 1985. There have been modifications to it when we did the Whittier Tunnel and a few other things, but a complete redo of the state rail plan has been in process the last 2 years. A lot of public hearings in 2013 on folks, and it covers not just the Alaska Railroad, but the 2 railroads in the state, with the Yukon White Pass Railroad down in southeast as well, and talking about what future applications there could be for rail in the state. Yeah.
Russia wants to tie in, no.
They'd like to have a tunnel or a bridge or something, a hydro train. I'm not quite sure what they want to do, but
National security would love that.
national security would love it.
Cross on his horse.
So the future of the railroad, always challenges, but we'll continue moving forward, no pun intended. We consider ourselves a very critical piece of transportation infrastructure, and as I mentioned before, we are woefully lacking in infrastructure in the state, so any opportunity to play a big part, we are happy to be. As I mentioned before, any large development project, we expect we'll be moving something. And it's good for the state, good in terms of economic development to have a strong Alaska Railroad. And internally, we feel that we're pretty strong at this point in time. We're lean and mean, and externally, we think we look pretty good. So I always like to hear from others telling us that we look good too. Always nice to hear that you look pretty. So that's about the end of it. Unless, of course, you're a big fan of Railroad Alaska. And then we're currently in the process of filming season 3 of Railroad Alaska. And as it turns out, we are very big in Eastern Europe. We've had quite a few viewers over there on the Discovery Network. We're playing on Destination America here, and as we understand it, season 2 had somewhere in the neighborhood of 64 million viewers watching this show. So
In Eastern
there's no
Europe.
accounting for taste. That's about all I have. I'm happy to answer any other questions you might have.
Okay, well, let's start in the back first. Anybody from the collective here want to ask Mr. Sullivan some questions? None?
Getting off easy.
Apparently so far, but the tougher group is up in front here. Let's start with Mr. Steele. Further?
I just want, the containerized LNG sounds like something that's got to be coming here pretty quick for all the outlying communities to barge in. The Tote is building a LNG container ship. Just seems to me that's a lot better option than other options that Fairbanks has as well, but just any of the communities.
Well, we see ourselves as an interim solution. At some point in time, we expect there will be a major pipeline down from the North Slope. But between now and then, in terms of getting gas from somewhere where there is gas to Fairbanks and to folks all around the interior, there's a lot of communities that we can serve along the way. And also, once you hit the rivers up there, you can, those ISO containers you can take right off the train and load right up on a barge and move up and down the river. That we're hopeful will play a part in it. There is a real good opportunity to be an interim solution to this.
Okay. Mr. Peterson, any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't see any mention in there of any study being done or anything about a commuter rail between the valley and Anchorage. There's been talk about that for about as long as I've been living in Alaska. I'm just wondering if there's any progress or anything
I've
about
got a
that.
couple of very large studies I'd be more than happy to share with you. We haven't done any recently. One of the key things that's come out of those studies is that probably the first thing needs to happen is maybe a regional transportation authority to gather all the groups together to make it so that there is good, solid cooperation and the ability to fund this project. As you know, there isn't a commuter service in the world that does it without being supplemented. So certainly we're not in a position to take it on. A couple of years ago, before Flint Hills, before coal started to tank out, our CEO and our management team had started looking at a trial process, a couple of winter trains that we would be running. We've purchased some property up in the Matsu Valley, in the old gravel pit up there, right across from Fred Meyer, that we have a building that it is our hope in the near future could be used for some sort of commuter service. So we're hopeful that that happens sometime soon. At the end of the day, it just comes down to dollars to be able to do it. And if things start picking up again, I think that we'd be in a position to run a trial service again for a year or two to see how that works and make sure that there is the demand to do that and what that looks like.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Sullivan?
Nope, good report, thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Howell?
No, thank you.
I've got a couple of questions. When you talk about your declining freight service, how does that affect freight haul through Anchorage then? Is the coal, I mean, it's my understanding as a layman's perspective, is the coal is going to Seward primarily.
Yeah,
Does that mean that we're decreasing the freight hauls through Anchorage
Yes.
now? Or is there enough other freight that the same number of trains are going and the same number of stuff is happening?
No, and so what we run on freight regularly is from Anchorage to Fairbanks, we run 5 nights a week. We load something up, we load up here, leave about 7 o'clock at night, roll in there about 7 o'clock in the morning. And that's just standard freight, that's not coal. Our coal was an irregular service that we would come from Healy down through Anchorage and then all the way on to Seward. And so it would always depend on the tonnage. So those trains just aren't running right now. So yeah, we've had a significant decrease in the amount of train traffic that's been going through Anchorage.
And if you build the spur off to Mackenzie, then would that essentially eliminate that? Or is there still freight coming into Seward and Whittier that would be coming up to Anchorage?
Oh, there's still quite a bit of freight. I mean, Whittier is our #1 freight location. So all of the freight that we haul up to Fairbanks and into Anchorage almost entirely comes in through Whittier. There's some of it that comes in through Seward, but the great majority of it comes through Whittier. So all of that comes through Anchorage. What comes through Seward comes through Anchorage. If one of the things that will continue to keep Seward to be when the export coal market comes back, we'll continue to make Seward our primary offload point for coal is the history there and the coal offloading facility that's there. And there's enough invested in that facility and the processing of coal that will continue to be our primary. There may be opportunities to go through Port McKenzie, but for the foreseeable future, most of that, if not all of it's going to go through sewer.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you.
Okay, our last item, I believe, Mr. Line, is the Coordinated Transportation Plan update.
Jamie Acton will give us a quick update on that.
I am Jamie Acton. I am a transportation planner for AMATS. I've come before you before to talk about the Human Service Transportation Coordination Plan. This is the update to that plan. That plan was originally adopted in 2009. And basically, when we saw the changes come through with MAP 21, and the plans are generally good for roughly 5 years, we needed to adjust the funding that was associated with it. As we saw changes in MAP 21, you'll see it in your MTP financials. Some of the funding sources were reallocated, some of them were eliminated, and then there were some additions to state monies that we saw. We saw an increase in the amount of Alaska Mental Health Trust funding that we received. So basically the update to this plan will look at the demographics, we'll review the goals and the strategies, see how we've done kind of a report card style. What did we set out to do? What have we actually accomplished? And move forward from there. So basically it incorporates the transportation for vulnerable populations, which people with disabilities, seniors, youth, and low-income populations. So we'll look to kick that off with we had an initial project meeting, let's see, 2 weeks ago, and we will move in April and into May with doing a larger stakeholder workshop where we'll bring all the parties that helped with the initial plan to the table and look at the information that was provided in the first plan. So.
Okay. That was very brief, and I appreciate that. It might have led to some questions from people. So, from the audience, anyone, questions? Mr. Steele? Peterson? Mr. Mayor? Kyle?
Yeah.
I am going to, just to make you feel loved and wanted, ask a few questions.
Yes,
Can you explain how this plan integrates with AMATS? I mean,
yes.
You know, in a nutshell.
So when I first came to you guys about this plan, it was as part of public transportation. I was working there. Public transportation had initially taken the lead in conjunction with AMATS for this planning effort. In the States, a lot of times the NPO is the lead on the coordinated transportation system, and public transportation plays a role in that process. So this plan, you'll see it in the MTP as part of the financials. AMATS receives a 25% allocation from the state to do a competitive process to distribute funds for capital and operations. It's very small. It's to the tune of $500,000 annually for coordinated transportation services, which either means purchase of service on anchor rides. It can be, Anchor Rides uses it in their fleet replacements. We have a group that's looking to expand the Anchorage Neighborhood Health Center shuttle that the Assembly helps fund through the public transportation budget. And basically it looks at gaps in services and it fills in those trips that are not necessarily generally covered by fixed route, paratransit, even commuter trips, if those vulnerable populations fall into those types of trips purpose.
So can I try to paraphrase and see if I'm right on this? But what you're saying is basically you're an independently funded organization, although you get some money, it sounds like, for some of your vehicles through part of an AMATS funding grant maybe, but most of the stuff you're doing is off our budget, but yet it's complementary to our stuff, and so you're kind of a complementary plan.
Yes, it's a secondary work program for AMATS at this point, and it's funded through the PL.
All right,
So.
thank you. I think that answers my question.
Okay.
Appreciate it. Okay, Mr. Lyon, have we exhausted the menu?
Think so?
Feels like it. Okay, so at this point, we go to the always potentially entertaining committee comments. Mr. Steele?
A lot of information. Good meeting. Thank you all.
Okay. Mr. Peterson?
I agree with that.
Okay, thank
I
you.
would say Mr. Sullivan and Mr. Friend do too.
They reached their capacity sooner than we did, obviously. Ms. Heil?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
The department has announced the new air quality director. Her name is Denise Koch. She will start April 1st. And I'm not sure yet if she'll be here next month. We'll keep you posted, but we're excited about that. So we have a new air director. And so there'll probably be a new person here.
Okay, so starting next month, you're going to see
Is
something
that,
else.
is that good or bad? Do you feel good about that, or?
I think she might be really good. I mean, I think she'll have a lot to learn, because she's
There is
originally with
that.
the department in the cruise ship program, doing the enforcement on that. And now she's been working as a contractor when she left the department and been dealing with air quality issues, mostly in oil and gas. So I don't know how much transportation-related experience she may have, so be learning for her.
Okay, anything else? All right, I think I will decline the opportunity to get on my soapbox as well. So our next technical advisory committee meeting is April 9th, 2:30 to 4, which I assume is still out at the Tudor Road Center, is that correct?
sir.
The next policy committee meeting will be April 23rd, right back here in this location from 1:30 to 3:30. So we've adjusted our menu. I'm going to adjourn this meeting.
Thank you.